The millionaire divorced his pregnant wife for his mistress. The baby inherited everything. Meet James Bertram, a charismatic millionaire known for his boundless ambition and ever-growing empire. From the outside, he seemed to have it all: money, power, and a devoted wife named Elizabeth, pregnant with their first child. Yet behind the glittering facade of black tie galas and extravagant parties lay a murky secret. James was entangled in an affair with his long-time mistress, Bianca. When the time came for him to make an unthinkable choice, James chose to divorce his pregnant wife in favor of Bianca. Little did he know that fate was about to unravel his perfect life in the most shocking way possible. James Bertram was born to a middle-class family in Springfield, Massachusetts. His father, Robert, worked long hours at the local paper mill, and his mother, Marianne, was a school teacher passionate about literature. Although their income was modest, they provided James with a loving home and instilled in him the value of hard work. James was a bright, curious child, forever dreaming of bigger things, particularly wealth and prestige. By the time he was 12, James was reading business magazines and soaking in the tales of corporate success. While his peers spent summer afternoons riding bikes through the neighborhood, James would be at the local library devouring stories of iconic tycoons. He was captivated by the likes of real-life magnates like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. Something inside him burned with the desire to build an empire. He began saving every penny he earned from odd jobs, selling lemonade on the sidewalk or mowing lawns. His parents cheered him on, delighted by their son's ambition, but they never quite understood where his unwavering determination to be wealthy originated. Robert often joked James, "You're going to change our family's fortunes one day," and James would simply smile, more certain than ever that he was meant for something grand. In high school, James proved his academic aptitude. He excelled in mathematics and economics, winning various competitions across the state. More importantly, he knew how to network. James would charm his teachers, impress local business owners, and gain mentors in the strangest of places. One such mentor was Mr. Ken Hathaway, a retired investor who often spent afternoons in the library's financial section. He noticed James's persistent interest in the stock market and took him under his wing. Mr. Hathaway taught James about diversification, the dangers of greed, and the psychology behind successful investing. Young James listened closely. The older man became a father figure he could turn to for advice when Robert and Marianne's knowledge on financial matters fell short. Ken recognized that James had a special spark, confidence, curiosity, and a willingness to take risks once he believed in something strongly enough. Despite the encouragement he received, James's burning ambition came with a hefty dose of pride. He told himself over and over that he would do whatever it took to leave Springfield behind and venture into the world of business giants. That single-minded determination grew, shaping his personality. He learned to talk people into corners with his persuasive, charming ways, and he always possessed an air of authority. When James turned 18, he left for Boston to attend a prestigious university on a partial scholarship. He also received some funds from Mr. Hathaway, who believed in him so wholeheartedly that he put down money as an investment in James's future. James promised to pay him back with interest once he made it big. In college, James studied finance and corporate strategy. That was where he met his future wife, Elizabeth Hayes. Elizabeth, or Liz to her friends, was a vivacious political science major from Chicago. She had a sharp intellect and a tender heart. She volunteered in local campaigns to help underserved communities and was an active member of multiple social justice groups on campus. Elizabeth came from a moderately wealthy family, but she never flaunted her privilege. She wore her compassion for others on her sleeve. Their first meeting was far from the classic love at first sight scenario. James had been leading a discussion at a student business club. debating the ethics of corporate takeovers when Elizabeth challenged him on the moral obligations of business leaders. Their lively argument went on for an hour, mesmerizing the audience. In the end, Elizabeth conceded that James had valid points, while James was startled to find he enjoyed the verbal spar. There was something in Elizabeth's fearless approach, her sincerity, that drew him in. They bumped into each other the next day at the student cafeteria. James mustered the courage to ask Elizabeth for coffee. From that moment on, a friendship sparked, and soon they were inseparable. Though Liz's perspective was often in conflict with James's, their arguments never truly escalated. They would debate, tease, and then find middle ground, forging a connection built on mutual respect. By their junior year, they were officially a couple. Elizabeth's loving nature and James's ceaseless ambition made for a dynamic duo. Despite their differences, they completed each other. She taught him empathy. He taught her to harness ambition. Throughout graduation, they held hands tightly, believing that no hurdle in the real world would be insurmountable. It was a fairy tale romance until James's ambitions began to eclipse everything else. After graduating, James dove straight into the corporate world, securing a position at an investment firm in downtown Boston. Initially, he worked as an analyst, toiling away for endless hours in a cubicle. He thrived in the cutthroat environment, delivering strong results for clients and quickly climbing up the ranks. Elizabeth, on the other hand, chose to pursue a master's in public administration. She wanted to become a policy advisor, focusing on education reform and social issues she felt passionately about. Their career paths diverged, but they still found time for each other. Despite the pressures of work and study, they lived together in a modest apartment near Cambridge, forging small moments of happiness over late-night dinners or weekend getaways. As James soared through the corporate sphere, he began to shape powerful connections. He rubbed shoulders with high-net-worth clients, took them out for lavish meals, and persuaded them to trust his investment strategies. James discovered he was exceptionally skilled at reading people and using their personal motivations to guide them into profitable deals. He was also working diligently to build his own stock portfolio, learning to juggle risk with opportunity. It was during this period that James started a small venture with a partner he'd met at the investment firm, a man named Richard Pearl. They launched an investing club that eventually morphed into a hedge fund. The initial months were rocky, but James's unwavering determination pushed them forward. Within a few years, their hedge fund blossomed, attracting attention from major players on Wall Street. Meanwhile, Elizabeth completed her master's degree and accepted a job at a reputable non-profit organization. Though her salary was modest, she was proud of the work she did, drafting policies to help underprivileged schools secure more funding. She and James often disagreed on financial matters. He saw money as both a method and a goal, while she viewed it only as a means to do good in the world. Yet their devotion to each other kept them united. They married in an intimate ceremony, surrounded by close friends and family. Elizabeth wore a simple, elegant dress, and James looked triumphant in a crisp black suit. His parents beamed with pride at how far their son had come. In the early years of their marriage, life was blissful. They moved into a comfortable home in Beacon Hill, ate dinner together whenever possible, and had inside jokes about how James was always married to his job, with Elizabeth gently teasing him into spending more time with her. On date nights, they ventured to cozy Italian restaurants in the North End or took sunset walks along the Charles River. But James's success multiplied at a dizzying pace. With more clients lining up to invest in his fund, he rose to new levels of wealth. His personal net worth shot into the millions. He began attending high-profile galas and lavish parties, mostly to woo prospective investors. Elizabeth joined him at first, glamming up for the black tie events, but she soon grew uncomfortable with the culture of indulgence and superficiality. The philanthropic hearts she encountered were overshadowed by those who saw philanthropy as merely another means to boost social standing. Elizabeth's gentle manner was often overshadowed by the wilder, more extravagant guests who relished flaunting their riches. It was at one of these parties that James first encountered Bianca Palermo. She was a financial journalist with a knack for turning heads. Bianca was known throughout elite circles for her captivating presence, mesmerizing emerald eyes, and a persistent flirtation that kept even the shrewdest businessmen intrigued. She was the type of woman who made it her mission to infiltrate the worlds of wealthy men, extracting exclusives and gossip for her reports. However, Bianca also had her own ambitions. She wanted to escape journalism's uncertain paychecks and become a power broker herself. James and Bianca initially connected on a professional level. She interviewed him for a feature article about up-and-coming hedge fund managers. Their conversations were peppered with easy laughter. Bianca was clever. She knew exactly how to stroke James's ego and fan the flames of his ambition. She didn't criticize him for wanting more. If anything, she encouraged it, fueling his self-centered desires. Elizabeth noticed Bianca's presence and the glow in James's eyes whenever the journalist was near. Yet, she chalked it up to James's natural friendliness. Besides, Elizabeth trusted her husband. He was driven, yes, but he had never given her reason to doubt his loyalty. Unbeknownst to her, the seeds of infidelity had already begun to take root. James was enticed by Bianca's boldness and the siren's call of a life unburdened by moral constraints. Eventually, Bianca's articles catapulted James into the limelight. He became a minor celebrity in the financial world, someone whose investment moves were studied and emulated. At home, though, tension brewed. Elizabeth wanted him to slow down, to spend more time with family. Her old dream of having children had found a place in her heart, but every time she brought it up, James deflected with talk of expansions and potential acquisitions. Their once blissful partnership was beginning to show signs of fracture, yet neither recognized how dire the situation was becoming. In the months that followed, James sank deeper into the high-stakes business scene, forging deals across continents and hosting exclusive gatherings at the Beacon Hill home he shared with Elizabeth. With new money came new temptations, a world of private jets, yacht parties, and never-ending attention from ambitious socialites like Bianca. Elizabeth watched from the sidelines, growing increasingly alarmed by how little time they spent together. When she voiced her concerns, James brushed them off, insisting he was doing everything for their future, that the hustle was only temporary. Elizabeth recognized a change in his behavior. He no longer took joy in the simple traditions they had once shared. Late-night talks were replaced with business calls. Weekend breakfasts turned into rushed cups of coffee before he dashed off to handle urgent matters. Even on the rare occasions they found themselves alone, James seemed distant, his mind elsewhere. Gone was the man who used to hold her close and whisper sweet words of reassurance. One winter evening, Elizabeth had mustered the courage to tell him she was ready to try for a baby. They had been married for nearly 5 years, and she felt it was time. James's reaction left her stunned. Instead of being elated, he furrowed his brow and murmured, "Is it really the right time? Maybe we should wait another year." She left the conversation feeling unappreciated and confused. They had talked about having a family for so long. Suddenly, he was backtracking without a clear reason. She couldn't shake the sensation that he was hiding something. Meanwhile, Bianca hovered close to James. Working at a prominent financial magazine, she could always justify her presence by feigning professional interest in his next big move. But James, for all his brilliance, was still naive enough to believe he could keep her at arm's length. He dismissed his own attraction as harmless flirting. She'd call him to discuss a potential story, and they'd end up chatting for hours about life, the future, and all the possibilities that money could offer. As time wore on, Bianca began to challenge him more directly. "Why limit yourself?" she would say, twisting a glass of champagne between her manicured fingers. "A man like you could have it all." Her tone suggested she wasn't just talking about money. James noticed her subtle hints, the way her hand would linger on his arm when they spoke, the invitations to private soirees where Elizabeth was not included. It culminated one night in New York City. James was there for a hedge fund conference, and Bianca insisted on meeting him for dinner, claiming she had an inside scoop that could be worth millions if leveraged correctly. Elizabeth, occupied with her own work, had stayed in Boston. Over steaks and vintage red wine, James found himself leaning in too close to Bianca, intoxicated by both her perfume and her words of praise. She told him that she saw in him an unstoppable force, that with her guidance and connections, there was no limit to what he could accomplish. It was the first time James felt fully recognized, not just as a husband or a hedge fund manager, but as a rising titan, unstoppable in his quest for power. Elizabeth's gentle encouragement had always been tempered by moral considerations. She'd praise him, but remind him to think of the social impact. Bianca, on the other hand, had no such constraints. She wanted him to push the boundaries, to satisfy every hunger. That night, fueled by ambition and alcohol, they ended up in Bianca's hotel suite. It started with a lingering kiss that escalated into a betrayal James would spend years refusing to properly regret. In the morning, as he quietly dressed in the golden light filtering through expensive drapes, he convinced himself that it was a singular moment of weakness. He told himself he'd go home and rekindle his marriage. He promised he'd set boundaries with Bianca, but those promises collapsed the minute he saw her again. Bianca offered the thrill of a flame that burned bright, without shame or apology. Their affair continued in secret, with stolen weekends in upscale resorts and whispered phone calls at odd hours. James kept telling himself he could balance both lives, his marriage and his affair, so long as he was discreet. After all, had he not always been good at juggling multiple priorities? Elizabeth sensed the shift. The man she loved was drifting further away, working longer hours, returning home late at night, with vague excuses. He stopped looking her in the eye. She noticed the discreet scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his shirt collars. Her suspicions nagged at her, but her heart refused to accept the possibility that James had found someone else. Just as these cracks threatened to shatter their foundation, life threw another surprise their way. Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected something was off when she felt nauseous every morning, and her sense of smell became almost unbearably acute. A trip to the doctor confirmed the news that should have been joyous. Overwhelmed by a swirl of emotions, Elizabeth imagined how James would react. She hoped this miracle would bring them back together, make him realize the importance of family. If only she knew just how deeply Bianca's influence had already entwined itself around James's heart. Elizabeth's hands trembled the day she held the pregnancy test. She watched the result window carefully, her pulse thundering in her ears. When the faint pink line turned more pronounced, tears of relief and fear mingled on her cheeks. She couldn't wait to share the news with James. She desperately prayed this would anchor him back to reality. That evening she made a special dinner. She laid out candles on the dining table, roasted a rack of lamb, and even wore the dress James had once said was his favorite. She greeted him at the door with a radiant smile, hoping to catch the warmth she used to see in his eyes. But he walked in late, brow furrowed, distracted by his phone. "I have something important to tell you," Elizabeth said gently, her anxiety mounting. "Sure," James replied absent-mindedly, still checking an email about a new client opportunity. She guided him to the table, took his hand, and summoned the courage to speak. "I'm pregnant," she announced, her heart leaping at the words. James froze. In that tiny moment, Elizabeth saw a flash of panic in his gaze, a flicker of fear that betrayed any excited facade he might try to conjure. Quickly, he pasted on a smile and said, "That's wonderful news, Liz." Yet the tone fell flat, lacking the genuine enthusiasm she had yearned to hear. Though Elizabeth fought to ignore it, that night ended with her crying alone in bed as James retreated to his study to catch up on some urgent work. In truth, he needed time to think. How would he manage a child when his mind was already consumed by business deals and thoughts of Bianca? Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth attempted to share baby updates with James' doctor's visits, baby name ideas, possible nursery decorations, but he remained distant. Sometimes he was short-tempered or left home early in the morning, mumbling about yet another meeting. Elizabeth grew suspicious that his icy demeanor had less to do with fear of parenthood and more to do with someone else. One afternoon, while tidying the study, she found a hotel receipt in James's jacket pocket. It was from a luxury resort in the Hamptons, dated the previous weekend when James had claimed to be in Chicago on business. Her blood ran cold. Laying the receipt on the desk, she let the awful truth sink in. Her husband was cheating on her, likely with the same attractive woman she had seen at social events. That night she confronted him directly. "I know about the Hamptons, James, so save the excuses. Just tell me the truth." James's eyes widened in shock. For a moment he considered lying, but her trembling form and tear-streaked face cut him to the core. Unable to summon an elaborate lie, he finally confessed. Yes, he had been seeing someone. Yes, it was Bianca. The next few hours were a whirlwind of shattered glass, both literal and figurative. Elizabeth, outraged and hurt, threw a vase against the wall, tears streaming down her face as she demanded to know how he could do this to her and to their unborn child. James tried to apologize, but his words fell flat. With his pride wounded and a large dose of denial clouding his judgment, he blamed her for not understanding the pressure he was under. He insisted that, after all these years, they had grown apart. Couldn't she see that? In a swirl of heartbreak and fury, Elizabeth locked herself in the bedroom, her sobs echoing through the halls. All James could do was pace the living room, replaying the confrontation over and over again, unsure of what to do next. Meanwhile, his phone buzzed incessantly with texts from Bianca, who seemed to sense that something was amiss. Despite the guilt gnawing at him, James felt a magnetic pull toward Bianca. The next morning, when Elizabeth left for her doctor's appointment alone, he found himself texting Bianca. In a few hours, they met at a cafe, and he poured out the entire ordeal, the pregnancy, Elizabeth's accusations, and his own indecision. Bianca feigned sympathy, but beneath her gentle pats on his arm, her mind was calculating. She recognized an opening to secure her future. Over their cappuccinos, she whispered, suggestions that James deserved happiness, that it was time he made a choice, her or Elizabeth. Exhausted and confused, James went home that evening, unable to meet Elizabeth's gaze. She looked so frail, shoulders hunched with heartbreak. For a moment, regret flickered in his chest. But he squashed it with rationalizations, telling himself he couldn't go backward now. Days turned into weeks of silent turmoil. Elizabeth slept in the guest room. Their communications were stiff, reduced to half-hearted attempts at civility. Then, in a shocking move, James presented Elizabeth with divorce papers. He suggested they avoid a prolonged legal battle, that he would give her a fair settlement, but that he couldn't continue in this marriage out of obligation. When Elizabeth asked about the baby, James's only response was to promise support. He didn't even mention wanting custody rights. He was too absorbed in building a new life with Bianca. Elizabeth's tears dried up, replaced by a quiet resignation. She was too heartbroken to fight. Memories of their early love and promises echoed in her mind. But she realized the man standing before her, coldly dictating divorce conditions, was no longer the James she had fallen for. She signed the papers. Her head pounded from the stress, but she refused to collapse in his presence. With trembling hands, she walked out of the Beacon Hill house, still pregnant with his child. A week later, the gossip columns erupted with speculation. Word spread that James Bertram, a rising financier with a net worth in the high seven figures, had left his wife and was rumored to be engaged to his mistress, Bianca Palermo. In hushed tones, Elizabeth's name circulated, the scorned, pregnant wife bearing the brunt of betrayal. Elizabeth relocated to a small condo in a quieter Boston neighborhood, away from the swirling rumors and the memories embedded in every corner of the lavish Beacon Hill home. Though she was heartbroken, her child became her beacon of hope. She poured her energy into preparing for motherhood, reading books on pregnancy, attending prenatal classes, and ensuring she created a nurturing environment. Emotionally, she was shattered, but she knew she couldn't afford to sink into despair with a baby on the way. Financially, she had to contend with the settlement James arranged. It wasn't minuscule by any means. He had built enough wealth to ensure she wouldn't starve. But it also wasn't the life-changing sum she might have secured had she fought harder. Mentally and emotionally drained, Elizabeth chose not to wage war. She had grown up in a loving, stable family, and the last thing she wanted was a protracted legal battle that would further corrode her already fragile state of mind. Instead, she took the settlement and tried to construct a stable new reality. Her parents flew in from Chicago to support her. They urged her to consider returning with them until the baby was born, but Elizabeth couldn't stand the idea of running away. Boston had become her home, in spite of the ghosts that haunted it. She decided to stay, continue her job at the non-profit, and face the future head-on. Meanwhile, James publicly flaunted his new relationship with Bianca. She was an entirely different presence in his life. Where Elizabeth was compassionate and moralistic, Bianca was brash, unapologetic, and hungry for status. She accompanied him to high-end fashion shows, made cameo appearances on financial news segments, and updated her social media with snapshots of their lavish weekends abroad. Though James sometimes felt twinges of guilt, like when he saw a stroller advertisement or a pregnant woman at a gathering, he quickly dismissed it, comforting himself with the notion that Elizabeth would be taken care of. He even told himself he was doing the right thing, as if sparing Elizabeth from a marriage devoid of genuine love. But whispers about his character started to spread in the circles that truly mattered. While some wealthy acquaintances admired his brazen approach to life, others quietly withdrew from deals, wary of a man who could so easily discard his pregnant wife. James noticed a slight chill in some business relationships, and though new investors kept coming, he found that not everyone was eager to be associated with a man whose personal scandals filled tabloids. Yet, James was riding a wave of financial success so large that he hardly felt any repercussions in his portfolio. The hedge fund soared to new highs, netting him and Richard Pearl, his partner, astronomical returns. He upgraded his living situation to a penthouse overlooking the harbor, inviting Bianca to move in. She immediately took control of the interior design, filling it with modern art and expensive furniture that showcased the pinnacle of taste. To James, it was a sign of their union, but to Bianca, it was also a testament to her new status. As Elizabeth entered her third trimester, she tried, despite everything, to keep the lines of communication open between her and James. She knew her baby deserved to have some understanding of its father, even if it was only in legal or financial terms. Yet James's responses were always curt. "Let me know when the baby is born," he would text. "We'll figure it out." That was the extent of his interest. Despite the heartbreak, Elizabeth found solace in her friendships. Old college classmates rallied around her, hosting small gatherings to keep her spirits up. Her colleagues at the non-profit threw her a surprise baby shower, gifting her tiny clothes and stuffed animals. She smiled through tears of gratitude, touched by their kindness. As her due date crept closer, she couldn't help but feel an odd mix of excitement and fear. Excitement for the new life forming inside her, fear of how she would manage everything alone. In the still of the night, she sometimes woke up from nightmares where she stood alone in a cold hospital room, with no one to hold her hand as she brought her child into the world. Yet, there was an invincible core in Elizabeth that refused to break. This was a woman who had matched wits with James Bertram in college, who had once held her own in intellectual debates and policy discussions with brilliant minds. She reminded herself of that strength, whispering affirmations whenever doubt threatened to overwhelm her. Meanwhile, Bianca continued to stoke James's ego. She'd heard about Elizabeth's pregnancy, of course, but she persuaded James that they should focus on their future, maybe even have their own child eventually. She flattered him relentlessly, calling him a man of vision. In her arms, James could temporarily forget the moral quagmire he was in. As the final weeks of Elizabeth's pregnancy came and went, James still hadn't shown any genuine interest or affection. He occasionally emailed Elizabeth's lawyer about logistics, but he never once visited her doctor, never once asked how she was faring. The baby had become an inconvenient reminder of the life he had discarded. No one could foresee the seismic shifts about to upend James's grand, glittering world. In his pursuit of unbridled ambition and pleasure, he had unwittingly set the stage for a dramatic downfall, one that would test everyone's limits, especially his own. Finally, after 9 long months of emotional and physical upheaval, Elizabeth went into labor late one evening. Her contractions started while she was alone in her condo. Pain ripped through her abdomen, and she instinctively called an ambulance. As hospital staff readied her for delivery, she texted James a last-ditch attempt to inform the father of her child. His phone, however, was off. He was halfway around the world in Dubai, attending a high-profile investment summit with Bianca. The labor was excruciating, but in the early hours of dawn, Elizabeth gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Lucas James Hayes Lucas, meaning bringer of light, and James after the father she wished Lucas would one day know in a kinder capacity. When she held him, everything else faded away, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the painful divorce. In that moment, it was just mother and child, wrapped in love. Word eventually reached James through his business partner, Richard Pearl, who had spotted a single line note from Elizabeth's lawyer. James read the news with a mixture of awkward relief and confusion. He typed a quick email asking for details, but returned to the swirl of meetings and lavish after parties in Dubai. He reasoned he could handle paternal responsibilities once he got back to the States. In Boston, the days after Lucas's birth were filled with a quiet, profound joy for Elizabeth. Her parents stayed with her, helping with late-night feedings and diaper changes. Friends from the non-profit visited with homemade casseroles and baskets of baby essentials. Elizabeth, despite her exhaustion, radiated a maternal glow. One afternoon, a couple of weeks later, she received a call from a lawyer she had never heard of, Mr. Baldwin, representing James's paternal great-uncle, the late Gregory Bertram. This was a shock because Elizabeth barely knew that side of James's family. James had mentioned a great-uncle once, but it was always in passing someone who lived in relative isolation and had no children of his own. Baldwin informed Elizabeth that Lucas had been named as the sole heir to Gregory Bertram's estate, an estate rumored to be worth tens of millions of dollars. Apparently, Gregory had never liked James's father, Robert, or James himself. He had disapproved of what he considered a ruthless streak in the Bertram men, but he felt a connection to the family name and wanted it passed on in a more wholesome vessel. That vessel, ironically, was the newborn baby boy. Stunned, Elizabeth sat down at her kitchen table, cradling Lucas in her arms as the lawyer explained the complicated terms. Everything Gregory owned, various property holdings, investments, and even a share in a luxury hotel chain, would be held in a trust for Lucas, until he reached adulthood. Until then, Elizabeth would be entrusted with certain managerial powers, as she was Lucas's legal guardian. Her mind reeled. The baby, not even a month old, had effectively inherited a fortune far surpassing James's own net worth. But, James, does he know? Elizabeth asked, her voice shaky. Mr. Baldwin replied, I will inform him. However, the will explicitly bypasses James. According to Mr. Gregory Bertram's instructions, James is not to benefit in any way from the estate. There's a restraining clause. If James tries to manipulate or access the trust, the assets default to a charitable foundation. Elizabeth let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. If James got wind of this, there would be chaos. Tucking her phone against her ear, she rocked Lucas gently, feeling an odd surge of vindication. It wasn't that she wanted to spite James, but she couldn't deny the deep sense of poetic justice. He had abandoned her and his unborn child, and now that child had unknowingly become wealthier than James could ever imagine. Meanwhile, halfway around the globe, James was in the midst of a negotiation that could propel his hedge fund to even greater heights. He had no inkling of the drama unfolding at home. Bianca sipped cocktails poolside at the resort, reveling in the attention of wealthy investors. She enjoyed playing the trophy partner, collecting compliments on her impeccable style and her cunning intellect. When James finally returned stateside and checked his messages, he saw multiple voicemails from Mr. Baldwin. He played them one by one, confusion morphing into outrage, then into stunned disbelief. This was a thunderbolt from the grave. The old man, who rarely kept in touch with the family, had effectively slapped James across the face with a posthumous decree, handing the fortune to a newborn child. Furious, James contacted Elizabeth's lawyer, demanding an explanation. He ranted, "That fortune belongs to the Bertram name. How can my own flesh and blood inherit while I'm shut out?" The lawyer calmly reiterated that the will was airtight. Gregory's intention was unambiguous, and any attempt to contest it would likely fail, and even if James tried, he could trigger the trust's philanthropic clause, transferring the entire fortune to charity. Rage coursed through him. Bianca initially tried to dismiss the entire situation, claiming James was already wealthy and didn't need Gregory's money. But soon, she realized the magnitude of the Bertram estate. The entire ordeal hinted at something more significant. If James was losing favor within his own family legacy, perhaps this pattern might repeat in the business world. Bianca had pinned her hopes on James's unstoppable rise to affluence. Suddenly, he seemed vulnerable. That evening, James stared at the city lights from his penthouse window, a glass of whiskey in hand. His once celebrated reflection now looked distorted, overshadowed by the creeping suspicion that the world was turning against him. His baby, now stood to overshadow his accomplishments. Could he mend the rift with Elizabeth to gain a foothold in Gregory's fortune, or was it too late? In the days that followed, James found himself oscillating between fury and remorse. He realized he had never even seen his son. He thought about the day Elizabeth left the Beacon Hill house, pregnant and trembling. For the first time, a pang of regret gnawed at his consciousness, nagging him with the question, had he thrown away something priceless, not just in wealth, but in life itself? If James thought the shock of Gregory's will was the climax, he was sorely mistaken. Dark clouds gathered over his lavish existence. As if on cue, his hedge fund faced an onslaught of challenges. A key client, a pension fund with billions in assets, suddenly pulled out, citing concerns over the fund's investment strategies. Rumors circulated that James's risk-taking had become reckless, chasing quick profits at the expense of stability. To make matters worse, a regulatory body began investigating one of James's overseas transactions. They questioned whether his partnership in Dubai might have skirted certain compliance rules. Though James's lawyers were confident they could clear his name, the mere hint of scandal made other investors skittish. In a matter of weeks, the hedge fund's assets under management dropped dramatically. James and Richard Pearl scrambled to reassure stakeholders, but the hemorrhaging continued. Every day brought new phone calls from concerned clients wanting to withdraw their money, compounding the crisis. During this period, Bianca found herself deeply unnerved. She had grown used to the perks of being James's partner: private jets, designer wardrobes, invitations to the upper echelons of finance. But now she had to grapple with the possibility that the golden goose was losing its shine. She and James argued frequently. He accused her of not being supportive, and she accused him of mismanagement and failing to protect his empire. A phone call one late afternoon nearly broke James entirely. He learned that the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) was launching a formal inquiry into one of his largest trades from the past year. Though James maintained it was legitimate, the negative press coverage made him look like a potential fraudster. Wall Street began whispering that James Bertram's star had burned too brightly too fast and was now crashing in dramatic fashion. A week later, Richard Pearl invited James to an urgent meeting at a discreet, upscale bar. There, as the amber lights glowed over them, Richard dropped another bombshell. He wanted to disassociate from James to save the hedge fund. "Look," Richard said, his voice wavering, "I have a family to protect. This kind of press is lethal. If we don't remove you as the public face, the entire operation is going under." James felt a hot surge of betrayal. "We built this together, Richard. You can't just shove me out." Richard leaned forward, adopting a hushed tone. "It's a matter of survival. Maybe if you step away, the dust will settle and we can restructure." He said nothing about taking care of James financially. His eyes conveyed a blend of pity and self-preservation. Enraged, James slammed his hand on the table, but deep down he knew he was cornered. Investors wanted a scapegoat, and James, now infamous for personal scandals and risky trades, fit the bill perfectly. He left the bar that night, not just with the weight of potential legal battles on his shoulders, but also with the realization that the empire he'd forged might be beyond rescue. Once home, Bianca and James had their most vicious fight yet. She didn't mince words. "If you lose everything, what happens to me? I sacrificed my career for you." She demanded to know his plan, but James had no answers. In the next breath, she mentioned the possibility of them relocating to Europe, a vague plan to outrun the chaos. James laughed bitterly. "You think I can just run away from SEC investigations and crumbling finances?" Their argument escalated into a shouting match, with accusations flying. Bianca stormed out, leaving James alone in the penthouse with the swirling city lights and the emptiness of his fading power. Unable to sleep, he stared at the mirror, confronting the reflection of a man who had it all and threw it away: money, love, family, his unborn child. Amid this turmoil, he found himself thinking about Elizabeth and Lucas. He remembered the phone calls he ignored, the ultrasound appointment he never attended. A pang of something like guilt or regret coursed through him. Had he made a catastrophic mistake? He decided he needed to see his son. Not just for the money or Gregory's estate. He wanted to know if there was any part of his life worth salvaging. So, in a moment of desperation, he reached out to Elizabeth. He texted her late at night, saying he wanted to meet Lucas. He wrote a stumbling attempt at an apology. "I realize how awful I've been. I'd like a chance to see my son." Elizabeth took a moment to reply, her heart pounding. Anger and hurt consumed her, but she felt that Lucas deserved some connection to his father. Reluctantly, she agreed to a short visit on her terms. That Sunday, James arrived at her condo building. He wore a simple shirt and jeans, so unlike the tailored suits he favored. The doorman recognized him from the tabloids but offered no greeting. James felt the sting of anonymity, as if he were no longer the man who once commanded respect everywhere he went. When Elizabeth opened the door, James's eyes fell on the sleeping baby in her arms. Tiny Lucas with a tuft of dark hair, oblivious to the magnitude of his father's betrayal. Elizabeth quietly invited him in. She looked exhausted but resolute, protective of her child. For a moment, James couldn't speak. A wave of contrition choked him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to fully experience until that instant. She gestured for him to sit, and he did so awkwardly. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "He's beautiful." Elizabeth only nodded, pressing her lips together. Silence engulfed the room, dense with unspoken words. James mustered the courage to say, "I'm sorry, Elizabeth, for everything." Elizabeth's eyes glistened, but her expression remained guarded. "It's too late for apologies, James," she said softly, turning her attention to the baby. "But for his sake, if you truly want to be part of his life, you need to prove it, consistently." They spoke in low tones for a while, discussing diapers, formula, and Lucas's sleeping schedule, mundane details that suddenly seemed extraordinary to James. He tentatively cradled the baby in his arms, trembling at the fragility of this tiny human who carried his name. A part of him felt a flicker of hope, some chance at redemption. But he also knew that outside this moment, a storm raged over his finances, his reputation, and his relationship with Bianca. Before he left, Elizabeth told him about Gregory's will. She explained that it changed nothing about her stance toward James. The fortune belonged to Lucas, not to James, and it would stay that way. James listened, numb, realizing that what Gregory had done was an irrefutable condemnation of James's character. The ghost of an old man had given Elizabeth and Lucas the power to keep him at arm's length. James departed that day with a swirl of conflicting emotions. Lucas's soft coos echoed in his mind, overshadowed only by the knowledge that his entire world was tilting precariously on the brink of complete collapse. In the ensuing weeks, James tried to salvage his business interests while also making small gestures toward Elizabeth and Lucas. He visited them a few times, each encounter tinged with tension. Elizabeth remained polite but distant, keeping the conversation strictly focused on Lucas's well-being. She allowed James to hold Lucas, observing him with cautious eyes. The baby seemed to sense James's discomfort, crying on occasion until Elizabeth intervened. Despite the awkwardness, James treasured every moment, his paternal instincts awakened by the presence of this new life he had once discarded. Meanwhile, the hedge fund was nearing total collapse. The SEC investigation gained momentum, uncovering a tangled web of questionable practices, some the fault of James, others traceable to Richard Pearl, or even unscrupulous partners James had taken on in his quest for higher returns. The daily headlines hammered at James's reputation, framing him as a disgraced finance whiz. His name became a hot topic on financial news programs, usually accompanied by phrases like over-leveraged risk and controversial ethics. Bianca distanced herself. She joined a wealthy investor's yacht party in Monaco, posting glamorous pictures on social media with new business associates. James tried calling her, but his calls went unanswered. At last, a curt text arrived. "I think it's best we take some time apart." That was the end of their tumultuous affair. Bianca vanished from his life, leaving him with the shards of his broken empire. Legal fees piled up, and James discovered he was nearly insolvent. His personal assets were tied up in failing investments and legal bonds. He sold the Beacon Hill penthouse at a loss, scrambling to find cash for his defense. Former friends and allies went silent, reluctant to be associated with a man who might face civil or criminal charges. Even Robert and Marianne, James's parents, expressed their dismay. They were devastated by his treatment of Elizabeth, but also saddened by the downfall they'd never wanted for him. In a final blow, Richard Pearl officially ousted James from the hedge fund, citing a breakdown in trust to the media. He pinned much of the wrongdoing on James, using him as a scapegoat to appease the regulatory sharks. James felt betrayed, but he couldn't entirely deny his own role in the fiasco. Between his ego, greed, and total abandonment of moral boundaries, he had sown seeds that now bore poisonous fruit. Depressed and desperate, James found himself one rainy evening standing outside Elizabeth's condo building. He had nowhere else to go. Clutching a half-soaked bag of belongings, he buzzed her intercom. Elizabeth's voice, tinged with shock, answered. "James, why are you here?" I need to talk," he croaked, water trickling down his face. Elizabeth hesitated. She was wary of letting him back into her sanctuary. Ultimately, she opened the door, partly out of concern, partly because she wanted closure. James stepped inside, clothes dripping on the floor, eyes hollow. He hesitantly explained everything: the lost investments, the lawsuits, the role of Richard Pearl in scapegoating him. He spoke of his regret, how seeing Lucas had shifted something inside him. Though Elizabeth remained stony, he fell to his knees, trembling, pressing his forehead to his hands. In a voice choked with tears, he whispered, "I'm so sorry, Liz. I was so blind." Elizabeth remained quiet for a long while. The sight of James, once so confident, so sure of his path, reduced to a forlorn figure was jarring. She remembered her own heartbreak, the nights she wept, pregnant and alone. Compassion warred with resentment in her heart. Finally, she helped him stand. She offered him a towel and a blanket. "You can stay here tonight," she said, her voice calm but devoid of any romantic warmth. On the couch. That night, James's dreams were restless. He saw flashes of his old life, the bright lights, the roaring applause, the flights to Dubai, the swirl of champagne. Then came images of Elizabeth crying, of Lucas's tiny fingers, of Bianca's smirking face disappearing into the distance. By morning, he felt a dull ache in his chest, a sense of emptiness he could not escape. Over the next few days, Elizabeth allowed him to linger, but her guard remained high. Lucas was her priority. She watched James feed the baby, fumble with changing diapers, and attempt to soothe his cries. Surprisingly, James showed a capacity for tenderness she had never witnessed before. Whether this was a lasting transformation or a fleeting regret, she couldn't be certain. Amid all this, James's legal battle intensified. He attended court hearings, sometimes with Elizabeth's moral support. She sat in the back, arms folded, carefully observing. The press swarmed, cameras flashing, as headlines screamed Bertram on trial. While the worst charges, those bordering on criminal, were dropped after a settlement, James still faced civil penalties. He lost most of his money to pay back investors and fines. By the time it was all over, James Bertram was essentially bankrupt, a pariah in financial circles. In a twist of fate, Elizabeth ended up in possession of the very wealth James had once idolized. Lucas's trust, courtesy of Gregory's will, dwarfed any resources James could dream of, yet Elizabeth refused to view it as her personal gain. She kept it locked in trust for Lucas, determined to raise him with the values of compassion and integrity she cherished. Seeing the irony, James sometimes wept in private. He had cast aside Elizabeth and their unborn child, only to watch that very child inherit the fortune he'd so desperately chased. Karma had indeed come full circle. Months slipped by, seasons changed. James remained under Elizabeth's roof, though in a state of emotional limbo. On one hand, he contributed by doing household chores and caring for Lucas, determined to prove he was not the same callous man who once served her divorce papers. On the other hand, he felt unworthy, haunted by memories of his affair and the empire he'd lost. His greatest fear was that Elizabeth would evict him the moment he showed any sign of reverting to his old ways. For Elizabeth, it was a day-by-day journey of cautious acceptance. She couldn't deny that James was genuinely trying. He woke up multiple times in the night to feed Lucas or rock him back to sleep. He'd walk him in the stroller through the neighborhood, giving Elizabeth a break. He even started asking her questions about her work at the non-profit, showing genuine interest in how policy changes affected local schools. The metamorphosis was slow, but it appeared real. James enrolled in therapy to address his self-destructive patterns and insatiable need for validation. The counselor pointed out that James's childhood dream of wealth had become a toxic force, overshadowing other crucial aspects of life. Through reflection, James realized how he had systematically neglected empathy, loyalty, and morality in his pursuit of power. The downfall had stripped him bare, forcing him to confront these truths. Some nights, James and Elizabeth sat in the living room while Lucas slept. They sipped tea in silence at first. Then the conversations deepened, bridging the yawning gap between them. Elizabeth shared how it felt to be left alone, pregnant, and ridiculed by tabloids. James, tears in his eyes, apologized anew. When Elizabeth pressed him about Bianca, he admitted he was infatuated by the way she pushed him to chase limitless success without moral restraint. But that freedom came at the cost of his soul. Elizabeth never promised forgiveness, yet day by day her icy demeanor thawed. She saw glimmers of the man she'd fallen in love with years ago, a man with enormous potential, albeit flawed. She recognized that James might never fully escape the consequences of his actions, but perhaps he could learn and grow into a better father, a better person. That realization brought a measure of peace to them both. Meanwhile, Lucas blossomed. His giggles brightened the home. At 8 months old, he began crawling, cooing at his parents, as if to say he believed in the love they could share. Elizabeth, witnessing James's gentleness with their son, allowed a cautious hope to form. Perhaps, for Lucas's sake, they could establish a new harmony, if not as husband and wife, then at least as co-parents united in responsibility. One Sunday, Elizabeth proposed they visit Robert and Marianne James's parents, who hadn't seen Lucas yet, as they distanced themselves during James's scandal. Nervous, James agreed, though he worried about the judgment that surely awaited him. When they arrived, Robert opened the door to see his son standing there, baby in arms, and a wave of unspoken emotion rippled through them all. Marianne let out a muffled cry of relief, swooping in to embrace Elizabeth and cradle baby Lucas. They spent the afternoon sharing stories, regrets, and promises that the family bond would be rebuilt. At night, as they drove back, James was unusually quiet. Eventually he murmured, "Thank you for letting me be a part of this." Elizabeth glanced over, saw the sincerity etched on his face, and managed a gentle nod. Neither spoke of the pain that once tore them apart, but the silence was comforting, like a fragile truce with the past. Though James was effectively blacklisted from mainstream finance, he found a glimmer of opportunity in a surprising place, a small local bank that offered community loans. They needed someone with financial acumen. Despite the stigma attached to James's name, the manager, Sandra Fletcher, was willing to give him a second chance, provided he passed background checks and adhered to strict ethical guidelines. She believed in redemption and insisted on thorough oversight to ensure he played by the rules. With humility, James accepted the entry-level position light years away from the prestige of running a multi-million-dollar hedge fund, but honest work nonetheless. Bit by bit, routine took shape. James woke up early to help Elizabeth with Lucas, then commuted to his new job. He worked diligently, applying the same analytical skills he once employed at the highest echelons of finance, only now in the service of small business owners and community projects. In some ways, it was more fulfilling. He saw families securing loans for their first home, local entrepreneurs launching shops that contributed to the neighborhood economy. And each evening he returned to Elizabeth's condo, welcomed by Lucas's outstretched arms and a sense of belonging he realized he had never truly felt before. The hush of nighttime often prompted introspection. James lay awake, remembering the extravagant galas, the best champagne, the swirl of paparazzi lights. Now his life revolved around a child's laughter, a simple paycheck, and cautious smiles from the woman whose heart he had shattered. Oddly, he was content. He'd stumbled upon a lesson far more valuable than any in his old business textbooks. Genuine wealth is measured in love and trust, not in millions of dollars or high-profile accolades. And so, the man who had once been a rising star in finance, who abandoned his pregnant wife for a mistress, found himself living a quiet life of atonement. He was far from perfect, but each day he inched toward becoming the person Elizabeth and Lucas deserved. Whether she would ever fully forgive him, he could not say. Yet he continued trying, for he had discovered that redemption, while costly, offered a peace that ambition alone could never buy. And that, dear viewers, is the incredible journey of James Bertram, a man who lost it all in his pursuit of wealth and betrayal, only to find a path to redemption through fatherhood and humility. His downfall reveals a timeless lesson. No fortune can replace the unwavering bond of family, and no ambition is worth sacrificing one's moral compass. If this dramatic tale moved you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more captivating real-life and fictional stories that shine a light on human resilience, love, and the power of second chances. By sharing, you help others discover life-changing stories that inspire reflection and growth. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching, and remember, true wealth is measured not in riches, but in the sincerity of our hearts.